Good afternoon, everybody. As people start loading in, we're going to start with our spring meeting conference, a video to advertise our spring meeting conference this coming May. Thank you. ULI Toronto is very excited to be welcoming 4,000 international experts from across the real estate and land use industries globally to Toronto next May the 16th to the 18th. The first time we'll have ever hosted this conference, this Urban Land Institute conference. And to learn more details about the conference, we'll put a link into the chat for you. We also want to just take a quick opportunity at the top here to remind everybody that of the benefits of being a ULI member. There are many, everything from the global membership directory to the navigator to get involved with ULI through a myriad different ways. You can also find a very powerful networking tool that members have access to, lists of people who are attending events in advance or after the fact that you can follow up on, and also our Knowledge Finder, which is this incredible archive of international case studies and other information with a really powerful keyword search engine that gets you access to literally decades of Urban Land Institute work going back, I think, all the way to the 1940s. Quite an amazing resource for members. Once again, everyone, thank you. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director at ULI Toronto, and welcome to the very final episode of our 5-part National Housing Week lunchtime webinar series. Today's topic: right to adequate housing in Canada, failing the underhoused and homeless. So before we get going, though, as always, we begin with a land acknowledgement. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI Toronto stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We'd also like to acknowledge and honor those who've come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those who brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend programs that we've uploaded into YouTube, and the links will be made available in the chat. Today's event and all other ULI programming would not be possible without the support of ULI's annual sponsors. I'd like to thank them particularly for their support. Now more than ever, ULI relies on this support to put on high quality programs such as this week's series and to drive our mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. To all of our sponsors, we say thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Adrian Pacini, partner at SHS Consulting. Before I hand it over to Adrian, I want to make a note to our audience that ULI is a nonpartisan organization and we do not advocate on public policy pro or con. We do, however, frequently take a critical look at public policy and the public policy landscape in the context of advancing our global mission. And that's what this week has been all about. So with that, and I'll just also say to our audience, we may not have time, as we've noticed all through this week, to get to audience Q&A. We do, though, encourage you to put them in the chat because they will be recorded. And we are planning on doing more work in this space. And your questions will help inform us where we might want to take that. So that is enough intro. Adrian, over to you to take over, and we'll see you at the end.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Richard, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. Really pleased to have you all here for our panel on the right to housing. So I'll flip to the next slide and we'll give you a sense of what we're going to cover today. It's been a really exciting week of all these ULI talks, and it does make sense for this one to be the grand finale. It feels like we're really trying to converge on everything we've learned all week. So today we're going to speak about the right to adequate housing in Canada, which is known as the right to live somewhere in security, peace, and dignity. We're going to try our best to answer some big questions in 1 hour, like what does the right to housing mean? What does it look like? What could it look like in Canada? How might we get there? And what is already being done in Canada? So to go to the next slide, I'll really excited to introduce our host of speakers that we have today. And in the spirit of taking collective action on the right to adequate housing, we thought it'd be really important to have a great mix of panelists that are covering different sectors. So we've got the nonprofit housing provider of Mariga from Woodgreen. We have our National Industry Association representing the commercial real estate industry. We have Michael from RealPAC here in the community planning space. We have Cheryl Case from CP Planning and the U of T School of Cities. And how could we not have someone from the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate if we're hosting a conversation about the right to housing? Pleased to have Emily Paradis here as well. So really eager to hear from all of our esteemed colleagues today about what the right to housing looks like from their respective vantage points in the system. So on the next slide, we'll share a little bit of the flow of today's conversation. So the goals for today: to ignite a bit of a conversation about what the right to housing is, what it could look like in Canada, and to highlight some of the work that's already being done. And to set the stage, we want to kind of introduce these new roles that we find ourselves in. So with our new right to housing legislation, we take on the roles as rights holders, as responsibility holders, and as duty bearers. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through. So the next slide will take you through the flow. We're going to kick us off with what is the right to housing? What might a role for each sector look like in realizing the right to housing? What are each of us contributing? And what are some of the big questions, tensions, and shifts that we'll all have to navigate as we're trying to get to this desired future? I just want to mention also, it's important to note that, we are having this conversation today. There are people who are currently experiencing homelessness as we're all sitting, in our rooms on Zoom listening in. They do not have the opportunity and privilege to have this discussion. So just wanted to highlight the urgency of this issue. But we are here to try and paint a bit of a picture of our hope for how we might actually get to the right to housing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who's going to kick us off and give us a little bit of an overview. What is the right to housing? Set the stage for us. I think you're going to start with a video and then we'll move into our group discussion. So over to you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Adrian, and thanks for that important reminder about the stakes of today's conversation. Before I kick off the video, I'd also just like to acknowledge the gift of joining from Dish with One Spoon territory here in Toronto. And I am always grateful to be able to refer to the teaching of the Dish with One Spoon covenant, a covenant between Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the lands and waters of the Great Lakes. And for me, this represents, as a white settler, a vision of an economic, political, and social system of sustainability, and one that has a lot to offer as we work through these questions. So to start us off on the question of what is the right to adequate housing, I'm going to first show a cute little video from the Human Rights Commission, and can't help but chuckle at the contrast between it and the kind of triumphal video that we saw off the top. And I think it's cool to have kind of both these visions of the city in this space with us today. So please go ahead and show the video.
Housing is a fundamental human right. Having a safe and secure place to call home helps people and families thrive and succeed. It is central to human dignity, well-being, and community. But a home is more than just a roof and four walls. It is protection from the elements, and it is a means to access basic services. It also keeps us safe and healthy. The right to housing means many things. For example, it means you're able to get adequate housing that is affordable and meets your needs. It means you can access housing without discrimination or harassment, and you feel safe in your home. It also means your home should be accessible, like if you have a disability or you're an older person. Many people in Canada still live in housing that does not meet these standards, and many do not have a place to live at all. The National Housing Strategy Act recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. It commits governments to focus on those in greatest housing need, to reform housing laws, policies, and programs through a human rights-based approach, and to involve communities in meaningful ways. The Act also establishes a national housing strategy with accountability tools to help develop and maintain the strategy, including the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate's mandate is to promote and protect the right to housing across Canada. The Advocate gives those impacted by housing need and homelessness a voice. The Advocate receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues and uses that information to make recommendations to improve Canada's housing laws, policies, and programs. The Advocate can review the issue. In some cases, they will refer it to the National Housing Council. The Council will establish a review panel to examine the issue more closely and make recommendations. The Advocate doesn't help with individual disputes. If you need help resolving a dispute, you need to go to the Landlord Tenant Board or Human Rights Commission in your province or territory. To make a submission to the Advocate or to find out more about what we do, visit the housing page on the Canadian Human Rights Commission website.
Thanks. And so, despite the kind of homespun vibe of that video, and in particular, the mailbox and airmail envelope that I'm not sure if airmail envelopes still exist, the right to adequate housing is actually very new, very fresh, very contemporary, very metropolitan in Canada. And the National Housing Strategy Act is actually a pretty big deal. It's the first time that a social and economic right is being implemented in domestic legislation in Canada. And it establishes some mechanisms that are unique in the world for accountability for this right. So please go ahead to the next slide. As the video touches on, there's a clear legal definition of what the right to adequate housing means in international law, and that's what's now being implemented domestically by the National Housing Strategy Act. So everyone's home has to meet these basic criteria of security of tenure, affordability, being habitable, accessible, providing basic services, culturally appropriate, and in an appropriate location. Everyone should be able to access adequate housing without discrimination or harassment. And especially in the Canadian context, it's important to acknowledge that adequate housing is a precondition for other rights, including our charter rights of security of the person. Please go ahead. So in February of 2022, Marie-Josée Houle was appointed the Federal Housing Advocate. And this is a new role. The role essentially boils down to amplifying the voices of people experiencing homelessness and people in inadequate housing, and holding governments to account on their human rights obligations. It's important to note that the advocate is a systemic accountability mechanism, which means that this isn't an individual recourse mechanism. Often when we hear about human rights, we think about individual recourse through something like a Human Rights Commission and people bringing forward individual claims through the courts. Instead, the role of the advocate is to identify systemic issues in our housing system as a whole that are barriers to the realization of the right to adequate housing, and to make recommendations to improve those. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the key piece around what changes now that we have the National Housing Strategy Act. The Act recognizes the right to human right to adequate housing in law for the first time. And as I said, it's a recognition that's not linked to individual recourse or individual enforcement, but rather to the housing system as a whole. It commits Canada to the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. So what does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean that the government has to provide everyone with a house. Instead, what it means is that the state has a duty to ensure that the housing system protects, respects, and fulfills the right to housing. And so governments have to use all the tools at their disposal. They have to dedicate the maximum available resources. They have to apply their powers through laws and regulations to advance the full realization of this right in the shortest time possible. And in doing so, they have to prioritize those who are in greatest need. So that means especially people who are experiencing homelessness and who are living in precarious housing. And governments particularly must consider the specific needs of Indigenous peoples and of disadvantaged groups who face barriers in our current housing system. So this includes people with disabilities, Black and racialized people, immigrants and refugees, older adults and youth, survivors of violence, veterans, people who are two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, queer, trans, and non-binary. And especially women, girls, and gender diverse people who are members of all of these groups face particular barriers. Now, there's some elements of the right to adequate housing that are not actually subject to progressive realization. In other words, there's not this assumption that governments need to take time to get us there. Instead, they're subject to immediate obligations, and that includes particularly non-discrimination. Governments have to immediately ensure that people aren't facing discrimination in their housing. And they also have to take action to address urgent threats to human dignity, such as homelessness. Another key piece is that human rights take primacy over other legal rights and responsibilities. So other legal regimes, such as criminal law or property rights, have to be compliant with human rights. And A human rights framework transforms our understanding of the roles of various actors in our housing system, as Adrienne mentioned. So people and households are no longer just kind of consumers in a housing market. Instead, they're rights holders who have a fundamental right to live in security, peace, and dignity. Federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments have human rights obligations. They are duty bearers. They have to exercise their powers in a way that advances the right to housing. For example, they have to take the right to housing into consideration when making decisions about resource allocation, laws, policies, and regulations. And finally, other actors in the housing system, from service providers to landlords to developers and investors, also have a responsibility to conduct their activities in accordance with the human rights. So this is really a transformative moment for Canada as we implement these human rights principles into housing. I'll hand it back to you, Adrienne.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I feel like that's a bit of a grounding conversation for us, Emily, to get us all kind of on the same page of what is the right to housing and what makes this different from what we have today. I'm going to move us into our group discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about how the right to housing is currently showing up in your conversations and in your organizations and with the people that you work with and the people you serve, and what you see your organization's role in the right to housing. We're going to hop around to different people on the call. We'll all just stick to about 2 to 3 minutes each, because I'll try and get through all of our questions for you. So I'm going to pass it to you, Mariga, first. Would love to hear from your perspective. We know that Wood Green does a ton of work to support people in greatest need. Would love to hear, what is Wood Green's vision for the right to housing? How does the right to housing show up in the work that you're doing and the impact that you hope to have on the progressive realization? Oh, and you're just on mute, Mariga, sorry.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I would premise my, thanks, Adrienne. I would premise my response to you by saying that Wood Green, the foundations of Wood Green were focused primarily on the kind of issues that informed the creation of the National Housing Strategy, and in particular, the right to housing. So when it comes to our housing, our primary focus is on the hardest to house. So meeting the needs for the highest needs. We also have a very intentional policy of, through our waiting list and through who lives in our housing, to make sure that we have a diversity of clients, both on account of race as well as on account of age, disability, and we incorporate those elements into our housing that we provide. We have a housing stock of about 1,000 units growing, and 60% of those occupied by seniors, about 20% families, single mothers with kids, and then we have a mix of young single males and women with issues of mental health and addiction. So we try and really cover the whole gambit. And of course, that the foundation of all that is making sure that the housing is affordable. So all our clients are rent geared to income based on that. And finally, we try and make sure that their ability to live independently is supported to the various degrees. So part of what Wood Green provides is an envelope of services ranging from mental health, addiction prevention, and we have a very strong relationship with the health sector in the East End. And so in that way, we're able to actually make sure that when people are housed, they have what it takes to meet some of the criteria that was pointed out here today: security, peace and dignity, accessibility, and non-discrimination.
Thanks, Mariga. It's great to have you on the panel, because I know that you're working with, on some of those urgent threats and the deepest need in our community. So great to have you. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to toss it over to you, Cheryl. Really excited to have you here as well. Would love to hear about some of the interesting work that you're doing too, and how it connects to that big transition that Emily was describing towards that right to housing.
Thank you, Adrian. So in looking at implementing the right to housing, we do need to be looking at the different layers of discrimination. So within our housing system, we're dealing with in the planning space, there's systemic discrimination, which is, I think, an area that we're starting to kind of move forward in terms of being able to talk about the fact that, you know, it's the marginalized folks and the lower income people who don't actually have input into our planning system and our housing economy, right? That is becoming more of a popular and common understanding about our housing system. And then also, of course, in addressing that systemic discrimination barrier, there are starting to become resources are starting to flow into organizations such as CB Planning that are directly about bringing attention and building up the resources for folks to be engaged who have not been engaged, and to confront the systemic and history of our planning system being built on a program of privileging wealthier folks and privileging the development of private capital instead of about being designed to build affordable housing. So that systemic discrimination piece is really core to, and addressing that is core to what CB Planning does. And so the way that we get around addressing that systemic discrimination of to bring people who are marginalized into decision-making tables to be part of the setup and implementation of the housing economy. So it's not just that we want to be able to give our feedback, we want to be part of the economy in terms of making decisions on what happens in the housing system and the planning system. So one way that we get towards that is by addressing the systemic discriminatory barrier of indirect discrimination. So indirect discrimination is when good things are hard to do, right? So we have all these different systems in place. So, you know, missing middle, for example, is one that folks are likely quite familiar with, right? You can take a bungalow and you can turn that into a two-story house, single family house, but you haven't been able to take that bungalow and turn it into a two-story affordable housing unit. You know, right now, actually, I have a couple of clients who want to build a laneway onto their property, but they just don't have the tools to make that an affordable thing to do, to deliver affordable housing in that on that site. So the roadmap, so CB Planning is working to actually to develop solutions to that indirect barrier. So it's very easy to build expensive housing, including it's very easy to even in our market right now, how it's set up, demolishing a 10-story rental apartment is actually sometimes a better business option than to take down a single family house and turn it into a 4-story apartment, right? You can take that 10-story apartment and turn it into a 40-story and the numbers somehow work, right? But the thing that's good to do, which is to protect tenants to build affordable housing, is not easy to do. So what CB Planning is doing to address that indirect barrier of discrimination is we're working directly with community groups across Ontario. So we're in Toronto, Peel, Hamilton, York, Kitchener-Waterloo, and Ottawa, and Hamilton. And what we're doing in those cities is we're partnering directly with local community organizations who have already been throwing in tons of sweat equity, trying to get their communities together to engage in the local planning process. And now we're starting to resource them with the technical tools as well as the soft skills tools to actually be part of moving the system along to make the good things easier to do. So that includes providing mentorship to folks so that they know how to build affordable housing, and then also helping these community groups be more formalized and more self-sustained in terms of being able to gather local input to participate in building affordable housing and having affordable housing policies and processes established. And so by addressing that systemic layer of discrimination and providing solutions for indirect discrimination to be addressed, that's how we can get towards addressing that direct discrimination, which is what you'll see when folks who are Black are being turned down to rent because the landlord doesn't want to rent to a Black person, right? Or people who are disabilities also having barriers because they have specific housing needs that are not typically met and provided through our housing system and also through our planning system.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. It's really exciting to hear about that initiative. And I'm glad that you brought up this conversation about engagement with rights holders and with people with lived experience. We're going to come back to that later. So thanks for introducing that topic already. I'm going to pass it to you, Michael. It might not be as obvious what the alignment between the private sector and the right to housing is, but I know that you see an alignment, and I know that you're passionate about this and doing a lot of work and thinking all the time on this topic. So would love to hear how the right to housing shows up for you in your work and the vision for the right to housing. And I know Michael has a few slides to share as well. So we'll bring up the screen share and I'll pass it over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, and a pleasure to be on the panel with my esteemed colleagues here. This is a fascinating discussion, and I tell people that this is half of my day every day: affordable housing in its various nuances. Next slide, please. As far as the right to adequate housing, I'm still on a bit of a learning journey. This really started 2 years ago for me, maybe 3 now, almost, when the pandemic started to do a deeper dive into this. No Canadian can argue with the objectives of this. The slide that Emily showed. Everybody should want that. Is it an obligation of housing of the federal government or any government to do it immediately? I think the answer was no, but we've all got a role to play. Next slide, please. So we actually like using the CMHC graphic, which is at the bottom of this slide, to segment the market and kind of figure out, okay, well, what are the typical range of rents in those segments, and whose responsibility generally is it? If you go to the next slide, I think that this kind of brings it home for the private sector. So we say that in a healthy market, people start off maybe they start renting a basement apartment or a bachelor, and as their economic situation improves, they typically move up, and maybe eventually they save up money to buy a house. That's the Canadian dream, and that's the way we all hope and think that the systems should work. But it's been difficult in the past 3 years at least, with maybe some folks going the other way. So that red line direction on the bottom shows situations or environments where people lose their jobs. People, as Mariga said, become dependent on drugs or alcohol, have mental health issues, and fall down that ladder. And while we all want that upper green line to be the way things work, we're confronted, I think, with that lower reality. And because of that lower reality, there's an obligation on private holders who might be on the right end of that spectrum to provide it, to do whatever they can to stop people sliding down that ladder. Next slide, please. So, up until the start of the pandemic, we were engaged in discussions around inclusionary zoning, for example. And a lot of the complaints around inclusionary zoning was, look, we do need to provide affordable housing in new developments, but at what point does it make the new development uneconomic? At what point do you say, look, this doesn't pencil out anymore, I'm pens down on this? Sadly, with interest rates going up by 2.5%, almost no new purpose-built rental buildings and many affordable housing, they don't pencil out anymore. Nothing pencils out with that increased cost. So we're in a bit of a difficult position. Next slide, please. I know we've taken a lot of abuse in social media over the years. We're rich developers, we're gouging tenants, but a lot of the groups criticizing us don't ask us, well, how much of your costs gone up? What about 40% raise in natural gas? Are we eating that? So the greedy developers thing, I don't think is helping the conversation. But what our industry is focused on is better data, trying to better understand the problem, and who's in these various buckets that my colleagues on the panel mentioned. Specific areas that I'm very much focused on, rent evictions, above guideline rent increases without losing access to capital, security of tenure, right of return. And there's 4 or 5 key topics that we're very, very focused on. Next slide. I have to remember if I have a next slide on this.
I think that's your last.
I don't. Yeah, maybe I don't. So, some of those maybe we'll talk on the next session, but there's certainly more that the private sector can do. I think we're on a discovery journey of trying to figure out exactly what does it mean when you say that we are responsibility holders, and how does that square with our fiduciary duty to our investors? How does that square with the leases that a tenant signed? How does that square with private property rights we thought we had? Those are the areas, that granularity is the area where we need to discuss. And when I get to the next question, we will. Adrienne?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Michael. And just wanted to share my appreciation for you raising all of those really important tensions. And I hope that we can get there in the next 20 minutes or so. So thanks for sharing those slides. Before we move on to that process of how we get there, I also want to just note kind of what Cheryl was getting at earlier, just this idea of a human rights-based approach to housing requiring the involvement of rights holders, so people with lived experience in all aspects of the realization of the right to housing. So just wanted to share a resource as part of a year-long project that we're working on at SHS with the National Housing Council. We've released a report on what we heard the right to housing could look like from the perspective of people with lived experience, nonprofit housing providers from across the country, and community organizations in Canada. So we've had almost 200 participants through either a survey or a focus group or one-on-one conversation. So if you'd like to read a little bit about what people in Canada with lived experience and the people who support those folks are thinking and envisioning about what that future could look like, we'll drop the report link in the chat. It's available online, so you can read it on the Place to Call Home website. So I'm going to continue the conversation now a little bit to our group dialogue. So we've talked a little bit about the vision, what it could look like, what we're doing in this space. We're going to shift, as Michael was alluding to this discussion of how we'll get there. Along the way, we know that there's quite a few tensions at play. There's quite a few competing alternative paths of what this future could look like, and some pretty big societal and cultural shifts that might need to happen through this transition. So I'm going to send it back to Emily. Just to reinforce a little bit this clear distinction about what the difference between the right to housing is and what we have today in Canada. I guess the system we have today, what makes the implementation this big shift to something new? And in your work at the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, what have been some of the tensions that you've come up against? And I think Emily has one slide left here to pull up as well to speak to.
Thanks, Adrienne. I really like this quote from David Holchansky and colleagues that ask the question, who lobbies for homelessness, right? Like if we can all agree that a housing system that produces homelessness is not acceptable, how is it that it continues to exist? What's the problem here? And the problem is it's the natural outcome of the way that we've currently organized our housing system. And so a right to housing approach really requires that we rethink that on a kind of systematic level, a structural level. It's not sufficient just to address homelessness kind of one person at a time or one family or household at a time. It's really embedded in our housing system. Now, the human right to housing is a new idea in Canada, and we're all getting used to it. And people have a lot of questions about, well, what does this mean? And there are some misconceptions. And we've been hearing some hyperbolic reactions to it that are grounded in those misunderstandings. So some of you might have seen a Financial Post story that came out a couple of weeks ago suggesting that our office is advocating that Canada implement a Marxist housing system, for example. so there's a lot of learning to be done about how do we apply this, the set of human rights in a Canadian context. And the whole point of international human rights law is to establish basic principles that all states agree to, regardless of the choice of political and economic system that they have. We know that Canada's housing system is very complex, and that diagram that you showed, Michael, is, it just scratches the surface, right? Our housing system involves all levels of government. It includes nonprofit and public elements in addition to the private market elements. And its operations are embedded in transnational and macroeconomic forces that are buffeting everybody's attempts right now to build and expand affordable housing supply. But right now we have to acknowledge our housing system perpetuates homelessness, right? 235,000 people are estimated to experience homelessness in Canada every year. And another 1.6 million households are in core housing need. So that's a system that's not working, and it's been not working for quite some time now. I can remember a time when mass homelessness was not a thing in Canada, but some of my younger colleagues don't know that it's a fairly recent development. And instead of at this point, I think most of what's been attempted to close the gaps are what I would consider kind of charity level responses. But that's just not working. And so an approach that's grounded in the human right to housing requires that we transform our response to homelessness and inadequate housing. And instead of relying on charity to meet the needs of people who are excluded by the current system, we have to reorient the system so that it doesn't exclude, so that it's just, so that it's egalitarian, so that it's fair. Now, identifying failings in our system doesn't mean vilifying any specific actor. So, to Michael's point about, the greedy developer narrative, or the narrative of, people not living up to their responsibilities, or needing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or stop eating avocado toast, or cancel their Disney Plus subscription in order to afford a housing. None of those narratives are really helpful, right? What we need is for governments to use their powers to ensure that the housing system we've chosen, which in the Canadian context is currently a very market-dominated system, that system respects, protects, and fulfills the right to adequate housing for everyone. And that means preventing discrimination, but it also imposes positive duties. It's not enough just to avoid discrimination. But as Cheryl said, we've got what you're calling indirect discrimination kind of built into our housing system. So I'll just use myself as an example. As a homeowner, when I sell my house, I'm going to get to keep all of the proceeds of that sale. I'm not going to have to pay any tax on it. And the foregone tax revenue that I benefit from through that as a homeowner is a level of federal investment in me that no renter will ever enjoy, probably in a lifetime. So that's a huge discrepancy between owners and renters. And when we look at who's more likely to be owners, white salaried professionals like myself, and who's more likely to be renters, people with disabilities, racialized people, immigrants and refugees, younger people, then we start to see the ways in which our housing system entrenches those patterns of discrimination towards certain groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that important discussion, Emily. Just watching the time, I'm going to shift around a little bit of the order here. So I'm going to send it back to Cheryl first. So I know, Cheryl, you're involved in tons of on the ground work Would love to hear what some of those deeper kind of cultural shifts that people are calling for when you're speaking with folks. What would they love to see to get us to the right to housing?
Yeah, so to get to the right to housing, we're calling for vertical integration. So folks who are working on the ground and working directly with community to confront displacement, to be involved in affordable housing and promoting affordable housing development, to be connected to the people who are making policy decisions, right? And so that's really what the roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism is all about. So Michael spoke about, this dialogue about the developer being the villain and they're doing terrible things. There are a lot of developers who really want to do more to help see affordable housing developed and protected, right? So the roadmap, we're really focused on building those relationships, right? So we'll be working on establishing consensus around what are the 5 top issues that are leading to our housing crisis, right? We've talked about, the financialization is one thing, but also the inability to get subsidies, or it could be the financing system as it is, the incentives around investment, right? There are so many different types of problems that exist that we just simply are not gathering together to dive into, right? So the people on the ground really do want to see that vertical integration, to be working in solidarity with people who have access to wealth and policy makers to move forward together. So if you can please put the link in the chat so folks can get more familiar with the project, but that's really what folks on the ground are looking for, is that solidarity with people who have, again, access to power and wealth and policymakers.
Thanks, Cheryl. And we'll make sure to check out that project in the chat. So thanks for adding that link as well. Mariga, curious to hear from you. What mindsets do we have to shift to enable more of what Wood Green is doing?
I think the first set of mindset shifts is actually have to do with recovery. So I was watching that introductory clip on Toronto and its vibrancy. And I think one of the things that has taken a really hard hit negatively is the nonprofit sector for a number of reasons. The pandemic, has sort of created the whole volunteer base, volunteerism as a key resource in the sector. Yes, it is true that there is a greater collective awakening on the issues of inequality and inequity. So that's a really positive thing. But, some of those issues in the last 2 years have also caused a lot of decline in donations from donors. And I think, just not to over embellish this, half the people who worked in the nonprofit sector have pretty much burnt out because of the heavy service load component that we had to carry, and those issues are playing out. So those challenges and the mindset in order to reward the nonprofit sector and to give it the value that it has and demonstrated during the pandemic, I think is an opportunity that has been provided through the pandemic and some of the awakening around the inequity. The second aspect for me is what's happening around the conversation in housing. And the whole conversation about housing and affordability has shifted away from those fundamentals of what the National Housing Strategy spoke about and was introduced, and that is around security of tenure, peace and dignity, non-discrimination, and affordability in terms of income. And we have moved fundamentally towards a market solution in order to ostensibly stem or increase the notion of supply from the market side and produce a trickle down. I'm not sure that that's going to be really helpful. I think we need to embed some of those fundamentals that Emily is talking about, so that yes, we deal with supply, but through the lens of demand, of the demand population that is defined in the National Housing Strategy and specifically around the human rights foundational issues. So We have that end of the spectrum that I described earlier that Wood Green is works with, people who are marginalized for a whole combination of reasons that we talked about. And those people need to be at the front center of affordable housing. That is what we used to do way better in the 70s, by the way. The very birth of CMHC was around taking care of veterans after coming back from war. So yes, we had a supply need for them, but it was also geared towards those kinds of population. And eventually it transitioned into supporting the market. The last thing I want to talk about is just the housing market and, you know, the irony of the fact that 60 to 70% of Canadian wealth is held by individuals has produced, and then the performance of the market in the last several years, which has been a really hot place, has actually created the conditions for a little worse NIMBYism than we used to have before. And that's because naturally people have locked into that as their main source of wealth. So building in some of the middle-class neighborhoods in order to create mixed communities that thrive and are supportive is becoming more difficult. Fortunately, not to end with gloom, this past weekend, Wood Green was privileged to host an open house for a 59-unit housing with supports at Cedarville in the East End that was provided to Wood Green by the City of Toronto through its supporting low, marginalized homeless people, housing in that section. And we had about 200 people. And of course, we, confronted all the issues about, is this an institution? What impact is it going to have on all the NIMBYism? But I believe what I think I want people to take away is that creating that space for dialogue actually produced some very positive conversations. And for the most part, we felt that having that direct conversation turned things around, and that we will be able to operate that building in that neighborhood like a partner, which is what we like to do best as Wood Green. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mariga. Happy for you. Glad that you expanded the conversation to everyone in the system, not just our housing players, but people in the community as well as responsibility holders too. Michael, I want to be able to toss it back to you because I know you had some ideas of what are some of the tensions that you're coming up against. Maybe 2 minutes, and we're going to have to slowly wrap ourselves up here. But Michael, please go ahead. Oh, and you're on mute as well.
Sorry, a great conversation, and I just killed the second half of my slides because I realized, it's off point to the way this conversation is. It's a great conversation. What Cheryl said about cooperation, absolutely. The transition between the right to housing and housing policy, and what's that bridge, and what are some solutions that really are going to work? I think Steve Pomeroy talked about this maybe on Tuesday, and he said, look, we just don't need more supply. We need more supply at the right price point and for the right constituencies. Absolutely, that is true. And I know that we're, one of the things we're criticized for as an industry is upgrading old buildings. There's an area where we need really a good conversation. Some of this is to extend the useful life of those old buildings. A byproduct is rents are increased. We can't be slagged for increasing rents when we're trying to extend these buildings and make them safe, habitable, as best we can. So we need to be able to talk about those things. I think Maria talked about NIMBYism. Oh boy, someone said to me a few days ago, says, Mike, do you think it's bad putting an apartment building near a residential area in terms of NIMBYs? Wait until you try to put supportive housing in the same neighborhood. A lot more NIMBYism there. That's a cultural problem we have to address. So, I would say overall, look, the private sector wants to be part of the solution, wants to help get this country back on its feet, prepared to consider all kinds of ideas. With the one caveat is we can't push away capital. We need the capital for new supply. We need the capital to renovate and fix up these old buildings before we talk about greening them. So that's my boundary, is I got to be able to still get capital into this business.
Thanks, Michael, and an important tension there that we have in the system. I just to introduce in the last couple minutes here, we have about 2 minutes left. One of the other important principles of the right to housing, that there is no retrogression or backwards movement away from the right to housing. So we're not taking action that's actually taking away from our progress. Curious if anyone wants to jump in on that quickly. What does that mean? What's at play here to actually make sure that we don't have backwards movement? Maybe if you want to jump in like 20 seconds, and I want to leave the last word on what does it mean to realize the maximum of available resources, because that's another key piece. Emily, I'll leave that last word for you, but anyone on this notion of no backwards movement, that's kind of a hard one to wrap our heads around too.
Yeah, I'll jump in. That's exactly what I was talking about. Rent increases. Would you look at that as retrogression? What if they were absolutely necessary to keep the building safe and your tenancy safe? Which side does that fall on? That's a detail that's going to be critically important for the private sector. That's just, one thing that's top of mind for me.
Yes.
I talked about before, right of return, rent evictions, we can deal with those. Let's scale them. Let's put in a uniform code that applies coast to coast. Let's do that right. We can do that right.
So I just wanted to jump in really quickly, Michael, about the point about rental repairs. I think that can be considered a type of indirect discrimination. The fact that the system makes it so that the only way that you can make the building safe is that you make the building unaffordable. So imagine if you were to have maybe a subsidy program and some kind of policy framework that would enable that maintenance of that building, but then would not, require you to raise the rents, right? And actually would have a protection around the rents.
We've talked about that, and I'm good with that.
Thanks for raising that, Cheryl. A really good other, tension and two potential alternative paths there that we're dealing with. Emily, I'll leave the last word to you. What does it mean for us to actually invest a maximum of available resources? We have like 1 minute, and I think there's some links to drop in the chat here with some resources for everyone to read further.
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to make this pitch, Adrienne. So I think the common theme in what everyone is raising here is that we have a national housing strategy, and according to the Act, that strategy is intended to be the mechanism that moves us towards progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. But the evidence is mounting that it is not, it's not going where it needs to go. It's the resources it's investing are not addressing those in greatest need. They're not helping make measurable difference in relationship to homelessness and core housing need. We've got the Auditor General's report. We've got other evidence as well. And so that's a great place to start. And in the chat is a statement the Advocate released this week regarding some changes that could be made to the National Housing Strategy to make it more effective and to help contribute to some of the initiatives that Cheryl, Mariga, and Michael have pointed to. And there's also a campaign led by the National Right to Housing Network. That's the second link there that enables folks to send letters to their MPs to talk about the changes that need to happen. The good news is we've got the strategy. We've got, it's a huge $72 billion plan. We're at the midpoint. It's the 5-year anniversary this week, but we've got 5 more years to go. It's a big ship to turn around, but with all of us working together, and I'm very grateful to ULI for convening this conversation. I think we can get there, and we've got the tools. We just need to make them work better for us.
Thanks, Emily. With that, I'm going to close us off, toss it back to Richard. Really insightful conversation today. So thanks so much to everyone who is here.
Indeed. Thank you, Adrienne, Emily, Mariga, Cheryl, Michael. Thank you. That was a great conversation to wrap up our week. But it's clear that our week is the beginning and not the end of our conversations around affordable housing. There's so much more. I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this week, if I can say that, in what is really a troubling conversation is we're starting to not talk past each other as much in dialogues like this. And I think that's so critical. We cannot address this housing crisis at any level if we talk past each other. And everybody's got to bring something to the solution to this clearly. And there's a long way to go before we get even pointed in the right direction, never mind moving in the right direction. So been a great honor for me for ULI to be hosting you and the other panels all week on this conversation. As I said, this is the beginning of more, and I hope you all tune in the coming weeks and months ahead. You'll see there's a couple of events up on the upcoming events. There's always upcoming events. It is 1 o'clock. We always end on time, and so I wish everybody a nice weekend, and we'll look forward to, as I said, seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.